everyone. My name is Emily Wu Trong, and I'll be the facilitator for this peer panel. For the next 75 minutes, we'll be sharing our stories of growing beyond our struggles as individuals who have a diagnosis. It's always encouraging to hear others share their stories because each time we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we break the cultural tradition of saving face. And we also take one step towards healing ourselves. So when I first discovered Subtle Asian Mental Health Facebook group, Asian Mental Health Collective, it felt good to know that other passionate individuals are creating a virtual community and safe space for the younger generation to unload and create a dialogue about mental health. A little bit about myself is that I'm a second generation Taiwanese American born in Arkansas, but grew up in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California. I'm a suicide attempt survivor, diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and have been only sharing my story since 2013. I'm a wife and mother of 3 cats, and I love to foster kittens. Right now, I serve as the peer programs coordinator for NAMI San Gabriel Valley, facilitating weekly support groups. So thank you, Asian Mental Health Collective, for your efforts and inviting me to facilitate this panel. So we have several panel speakers today, and I will let them introduce themselves. So Chloe, would you like to go first?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Chloe Longfellow. I am calling in from Seattle, but I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I am a certified life coach and vice president of a nonprofit called Tangible Movement, which helps support people who are dealing with mental illness, racial and gender identity issues, and addiction. I am a Hapa, so my dad is white and my mom is Japanese. So I'm a 4th generation Japanese American and descendant of a survivor of the Japanese internment concentration camps. My relation to mental health started in high school. I had a parent who was battling, a parent and a sibling battling severe deep depression. I also have a sibling who is a recovering drug addict and alcoholic, and I myself have been battling anxiety and CPTSD for the past 7 or 8 years now. And yeah, hope to help spread awareness on it today. Emily, you're muted.
Okay, your turn, Darren.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everybody. My name is Darren Wakasa. Pronouns are he, him. I'm from Los Angeles. And like Chloe, I'm a 4th generation Japanese American. So I'm a descendant of Japanese American incarceration camp survivors. Might seem a bit of an outlier, but I'm a writer, director, repped in Hollywood, but have used storytelling and have led workshops in the Nikkei community to try to purge trauma physically through artistic means. My mental health friends are OCD, anxiety, and clinical depression. I was diagnosed with OCD probably about, I think, 2 years ago. So it's definitely an honor to be on this panel, and I look forward to hearing everybody's stories.
Thank you, Darren. Your turn, Joan.
Thank you, Emily. So my name is Joan Lee. I am a Chicago-based 2nd generation Korean American. I work in the technology industry, and I'm also a founder of a nonprofit called Empower Saturday School, and we do free SAT prep for high school students in Chicago. My journey with mental illness began in my late 20s, around 2013, 2014, where I became a paranoid schizophrenic for about 3.5 years. And that subsequently brought on a few other conditions. And those conditions were major depressive disorder and social anxiety disorder. And, you know, all of this kind of took about like 7 years to finally kind of journey towards mental health. As a result of kind of all of the work that I've been doing to kind of resolve these difficulties in my life. So I wrote a free illustrated mini book in conjunction with a super talented illustrator named Connie Van, based out of New York City, called How We Talk to Ourselves. And so it's just a book on positive self-talk. And it was this was a method that I used that was most impactful in terms of taking my first step towards recovery when it came to major depressive disorder and social anxiety disorder.
That's awesome that you used what you learned to help turn it into a book. So that's awesome. How about you, Jude?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jude Chow. I'm based in Southern California, but I am a second-generation Taiwanese American who grew up in Central Illinois, that of cornfields, cows, and pigs. I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder when I was about 20 or 21 in generalized anxiety disorder. I'm 40 now, so it's been a pretty long road along the way, but these days I am a beauty and wellness writer. I have a book coming out in March that is a hybrid skincare guide and self-care and mental health guide too. My work as a writer has pretty much always been tied to my own mental health journeys because I had come into skincare as sort of a tool for managing my depression and my anxiety symptoms. And I just, over the years and through the conversations that I've had with readers, have developed ways of keeping that pursuit healthy and turning it into something positive for us instead of a more damaging or potentially more disordered way of looking at life and looking at yourself. I'm really, really happy to be on this panel today. I really love having the opportunity to talk about these things with the community, and I hope we can do a lot.
Well, it's great to have you, Jude. How about you, Pooja?
Hey everyone, my name is Pooja Nagpal. I'm from Chicago. It's freezing cold winter out here, so I hope everyone out in the Midwest is keeping warm. I'm a first generation South Asian woman. My family emigrated from India in the 80s. I currently work as a recovery support specialist for NAMI Chicago. I know Emily mentioned NAMI. For some of you that don't know, NAMI stands for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It's a nonprofit organization that aims to educate and advocate for people that have mental health challenges. So in my role there, I support individuals that are living in a nursing home to transition safely into independent living. And these individuals have a very severe mental illness. And so it can be very challenging to live an independent life after struggling for so many years. And I think one of the things that helps me support them is my own experience dealing with depression and anxiety. And now, I guess I was also, my journey started in my 20s. I would say I've been fairly well for the last decade or so. So I feel grateful for that. One of the things that's really helped me is speaking and being a speaker. And so one of the ways I do that is that I've been lucky enough to facilitate over 1,000 support groups through different organizations, having conversations about mental health. I'm also the member chair of the Alliance of Peer Professionals that aims to provide peers a voice in the professional workplace. And when I'm not doing that, I like to make people laugh. And I've had a couple of stints as an amateur comedian, but I won't be telling any jokes today. I'm really grateful to be here. So thank you everybody for giving me this opportunity to share.
Great to have you, Pooja. I think that's a cool hobby of yours. There's actually like a comedy show tonight that is about mental illness. So I'll send you that information later. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll go into the panel questions. So one of the first ones is, how did you come to understand your mental illness as part of who you are? And I guess you can raise your hand if you want to answer, or Jude.
So I mentioned that I was only diagnosed with depression and with anxiety when I was 20 or 21, but kind of looking back on it over the years, I've realized that the signs were there as early as 14 or 15 years old. My mom had passed away when I was 13, and sort of the year after that, I was just kind of desperate to get away, escape from everything. So I skipped ninth grade and went to INSA, which is a STEM boarding school up near Chicago. And I found that the symptoms that no one was picking up on at the time, I just completely lost interest in everything. My grades started slipping almost right away. I thought I'm sure everyone just thought it was from being away from home and not being mature enough to be responsible for these things, but it was like skipping classes, not caring, not doing homework, just wanted to sleep all day. So I think that depression and anxiety for sure have just always been a part of who I am. So a lot of the journey that we take as we recognize that and try to grow beyond it is sort of figuring out who you are and what you're capable of. If you allow yourself to imagine what you would be like without these things holding you back. It's definitely eye-opening when I realized years later, because I've always regretted that I didn't take full advantage of the opportunity of that education. And then looking back on it and the hours that I spent in a guidance counselor office or in the nurse's office or just skipping class and sleeping, I realized didn't really choose to do that. It's something that was an undiagnosed and unrecognized mental illness that was starting to manifest for the first time.
Go ahead, Joan.
Okay, great. Thanks, Emily. And also, I can really relate to what you just said, Jude, about kind of like feeling like there were lost years or like lost resources that you didn't get to take advantage of. So definitely feel for you there. In terms of how my mental illness kind of came to be a part of who I am, it's when it happened, it brought a lot of shame to me. So it didn't fit my narrative. And, I'd been kind of living the model Asian life. So, focused on achievements and then also lifting the family from, let's be honest, like one socioeconomic bracket to another, if possible. So I did the whole like prescribed route. I studied engineering, went into consulting, got an MBA, and I focused on rising in the workplace. So that was my narrative, and I was going to stick to it. And my friends and peers kind of did as well, in terms of optics, anyway. But when I became a schizophrenic in my late 20s, it was very public. So I had posted the psychotic thoughts on my Facebook. I had actually reached out to even people that I didn't know and kind of was asking them, questions around like, why are you like trying to hurt me and stuff like that. So, there was a lot of public shame. And when I finally came out of the woods from the schizophrenia, I had to deal with the specter of being a public disgrace, and it forced me to live without people's approval. So that was the main thing. So I assumed it into my identity, but then I released it because I lost everyone's approval, the approval of my family, friends, and peers. And there were some lovely people and friends and family who stayed by my side. And I had to forgive myself for putting them through very uncomfortable situations very often at that time. I just knew that, I brought it into my identity, and then I kind of released it. And now it's back a little bit because we're talking about it, but yeah.
Wow, I can totally relate to that public disgrace kind of feeling, because when I chose to disclose and share my story with a Chinese newspaper, and if you translate the title to English, it was something like daughter of perfectionist parents speaks out. So it was just like my mom's like, oh my God, you're in the newspaper. Like, how could you do this to me? Like, are you really my daughter? Do I have to disown you? So yeah, going public is a big deal. So all of you are very courageous to share your stories. So yeah, Darren, you had your hand up.
It's interesting we're talking about the idea of culture and identity and the stigmas around it and how that plays into our mental health journeys. And I think for myself, to answer the question directly, I think I'm still kind of figuring out how mental health is a part of me, especially being a descendant of the camps, right? We talk a lot about intergenerational trauma. And even just the word trauma, I don't think was brought up in our community until recently. And so there's a lot that I'm trying to understand, I think, still. But and the first big indicator was back in high school. I think being a cisgendered male from an urban LA, growing up in the 80s, 90s, a lot of my feelings, insecurities, and mental health, anxiety, stuff that I didn't know then, just manifested in anger. And that rage, I think, very much hurt my family and hurt myself. And it's kind of like that metaphor of like the iceberg, right? The tip of the iceberg, right? You see the anger on the top. It's like the easiest thing to be able to grasp onto. But then underneath that, underneath the water, there's so many different layers of emotions and trauma and insecurities that I think decades of therapy has helped me understand more. But to be quite honest, I think I learn about myself every day, especially having gone through 2020.
It sure is a journey, each and every day. We're changing all the time. So, yeah. Anyone else have any thing to share for that part? Okay. And so how did family cultural influence your family or culture influence your illness, if it did? Go ahead, Pooja.
Yeah, thanks. I think that I think it's been mentioned so far, like culturally, there's so much pressure to excel, and there's so much pressure to be the best and the brightest, and that can just bring about so much shame and so much guilt. And I, wasn't the most expressive kid in terms of like having the confidence to speak to my folks. It also didn't help that I'm the product of a stereotype. Like the stereotype of Asians is that, they're doctors and engineers and lawyers, and my mom's a doctor, my dad's an engineer. Like I'm the product of a stereotype. So it was very hard to reach those expectations. And so I think it was also difficult for my parents, given their upbringing, not knowing a lot about mental health challenges. So I remember hearing a lot of just sort of like, get over it. Like, why are you complaining so much? Like, you have all of this stuff. Like, we lived a pretty nice lifestyle. Like, what's the deal here? And so it was not until like many years later that my folks got educated on this, and the language sort of changed, um, and things got better. And I also learned many years later that this runs in my family, and so nobody wants to talk about it. And I hope, I mean, I think that some of my family members are more comfortable now than they were before. But I think for the generations above us, it's still very difficult to talk about, because it's not part of the culture to share that. It's immediately like your value is, like, your worth and value as a person is attached to your achievements. And if you have a mental illness, it can affect your achievements. So now your worth is changed. And so that's how my experience has been culturally. Thankfully, it's not the case now, but it's not easy to grow up in that kind of thought process.
I have a quick question actually to you guys, or Pooja, even about that, if it's okay. Like,
Yeah.
do you all think that had the previous generations flagged certain mental health things that happened within the family, that would have made it easier for your journeys?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my grandma suffered for a long time. I'm not sure that her diagnosis was officially rendered to be bipolar disorder, but she had a lot of those symptoms. And she didn't really treat it until like much later in her life. And I think there was a lot of misunderstanding about her behaviors and what she did. And I wonder oftentimes what her life might have looked like if our family in India was a little bit more understanding. And what would that have, how could that would have probably impacted my mom, and then my mom, that would have impacted me. So I do think, Darren, that it would have impacted things differently had there been more education in the generations above us.
I think the idea of saving face was just so strong in our our parents' upbringing, our grandparents', and so yeah, it just became a custom for us not to share our stories before. But I think that as us being advocates and sharing our stories, that's where we can change the narrative for the the generations that come after us. Yeah, I think that with mental health not being talked about, I I, I think sometimes other voices can be stronger than others, and me being the youngest of three, I felt like my voice didn't matter. My brother's the oldest, and so I thought his voice means more, and then my parents didn't listen to me. And then also, like like you, Pooja, like my brother was the model child, and so I felt like they valued him more than they valued me. So I know that also impacted my mental health. And also, you said something about expectations, how parents expect a lot from us, and but then also the competitiveness of doesn't help our mental health either. And so I think that when I finally learned that each one of us is on our own life journey, to figure out who we are, what we're good at. We don't all have to become doctors and lawyers and engineers to become somebody. We are somebody. And even though that took a long time to learn, better late than never. So the next question is, how did you overcome stigma? Go ahead, Jude.
Yeah, sorry. I actually wanted to address the cultural question before we move on, because one thing that I've thought about a lot, especially after having my own son, is that for those of us who are first or second generation, whose parents are old school from the homeland, I think that growing up here gives us a certain cultural clash that can really cause anxiety and cause depression. So I grew up, there were hardly any other Asians. I don't think there were any other Taiwanese around besides my own relatives. My friends are non Asian. We grow up seeing our friends get hugs from their parents. We see our friends getting a different style of parenting than we have. Our friends get B's and their parents are happy about it, right? Their parents love them, they're demonstrative, they tell them these things. Our parents, with the best of intentions, show their love in a completely different way. Stereotypical old school. They'll feed you. They pay for your piano lessons. They pay for all your prep classes. They're on you all the time to achieve, because that's the way that they show love, whether it's healthy or unhealthy. They care about you. They want you to have a good future. But we see our parents treating ourselves this way, maybe not being real good with the hugs and not really telling us that they love us. I think that for me and for a lot of people that I know, it caused us to spend a lot of time questioning whether our parents love us. And that's such a crucial, important thing to know developmentally, that I think it's not at all surprising that a lot of us struggle with these questions, with feelings of abandonment, fear, anxiety, perfectionism, because we sort of were raised to think that in order to earn love, you have to always be on and always be perfect. And that may not have been the message that our parents wanted to communicate to us, but when you internalize that and you see it's not the same for the other kids, it's very, very painful, and it lasts.
Yeah, I can completely relate. Uh, because when our parents show their love in a different way. And one thing that I often say is that if they didn't, because of this general disconnect, generation disconnect culturally too, it we aren't able to understand each other very well, and so it's ends up being very difficult to navigate our worth as kids growing up when we don't have support groups to talk about this with other kids, or know that our value is not dependent on our grades or achievements, and that we're just loved and as we are. And but and so what gave you guys the courage to share your stories, despite the stigma around mental health, mental illness? Joan.
May I just say something really quick? It's related to the last question. Something you
Mhm.
said. You have to. So our culture, we're not really very expressive. So we have to be able to express ourselves and show who we are if we want acceptance, right? If you're never showing, then you're never going to be accepted as is. So that's one thing that I've been thinking about and learning lately. So that was it.
Chloe.
Yeah, kind of all tied into one is like, you know, the parents thing influencing and culture, and then also breaking the stigma. For me, you know, it was like, okay, my dad was raised Catholic, my mom's Asian, so everything was like hush hush, you know, just don't show your weakness and move on, and you're strong, and just kind of go through everything. But I think for me, to end the stigma, it was almost like I would look at them and I could see their pains that they've been through, and I knew their stories and, you know, what they had grown up going through, and I could see how it was affecting them, and whether they wanted to or not. And inevitably they kind of, you know, took it out on my brother and me. And unfortunately, you know, there's that saying like hurt people hurt people. And one of my therapists actually brought it into good light and was like, your parents did the best they could, you know, even though it might not have seemed like it, and sometimes you want to blame everything on them. It was like they were doing the best they could, and that helped me a lot, especially with a lot of the resentment and just understanding pain. And then in turn being like, you know, I have to break the cycle. Like otherwise I'm going to be like this to my kids and or in my relationship. And that's when I kind of started seeing it, like expressing that love in a weird way and being like, this isn't how I feel. Why am I expressing my love in this way? And so for me, it was really like, okay, I need to, even though I grew up with the stigma and everything being hush hush, I want to break that cycle, and I want to do it not only for me, but for my future kids and, you know, future generations to come.
Go ahead, Darren.
You know, I think one thing too, and I'd be curious to hear what you all think, is just recognizing. I mean, now that the conversation is a little bit more public, like growing up, I didn't even know I had anxiety. I didn't even know what anxiety was. I just knew I was pissed off all the time. And so now I have the vocabulary and the education out there, and we still have ways to go. Like, I think for my parents, I mean, they were always really supportive. I didn't feel as much as that same pressure, but I just don't think they had the vocabulary to kind of look at themselves and say, here are mental health conditions, and there's something you can do about it. Right? It was so normalized for them, especially being Asian American, because you're trying to achieve this American dream. You just shut up and do your work type of thing. So I think, you know, just the recognition of it, of what you're feeling and what you're going through, and then is kind of was kind of the first step for me. And it took my sister and other people to kind of point that out. I didn't even recognize it myself.
I'll go off of that. Because you're right. I never like thought I had anxiety. I would blame it on other things or come up with other reasons in my head as to why I was throwing up randomly at work and having panic attacks and being like, oh, it's because, you know, I have to meet this deadline, or oh, you know, whatever school thing related issue. And then looking back, I remember like my parents got divorced when I was very little, and we had to go to therapy. And I was at therapy when I was maybe 7 years old, and I just threw up at the at the therapist office, and it was like, oh, like she must be sick. And then almost like for like a month following. I would feel sick every time lunch came around at school, and I would go lay down in the, nurse's office. And it got to a point where my teacher had to talk to me and be like, why aren't you eating? And it was never, ever, not even until after college when I started having like major panic attacks again and just like throwing up out of nowhere, where I sought help and they were like, that's anxiety, that's your body's way of saying something is off. Like, I thought it was maybe a physical thing, and then it was like, no, this is bigger. This is an emotional and mental thing triggering a physical response. And it's crazy to think how your body can respond to trauma from so long ago.
Go ahead, Jude.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, thinking about like recognizing that there's actually something that's not, I don't like this word, but for us to recognize that what we feel or the behaviors that we have are actually driven by anxiety or by some other mental disorder is kind of a big deal, because I think that for a lot of us, whatever's going on in our heads, we just kind of feel like, oh, everybody's like this. I'm sure everybody needs to check their alarm clock 25 times before they can go to sleep. I'm sure everybody worries about these things all the time. And you can kind of recognize at a certain point, because other people are opening up and discussing these issues, that, oh, maybe this isn't how I'm supposed to be. Maybe this is not a healthy adaptation for me. Or I always just kind of thought I'm really high strung, and that's just how people are. But just hearing other stories and sort of comparing my behaviors to those of people around me when they're being honest, I can kind of go, okay, I don't think that this is normal. I don't think everyone does this. I don't think everyone thinks like this. So therefore, it is something that can be addressed and not just lived with.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. In terms of like undiagnosed symptoms, I remember that that whole negative like interpretation, what Chloe said about hurt people hurting people, that did I was kind of always on guard and kind of filtering, okay, is this person actually saying something that reflects poorly on me? Are they trying to hurt me somehow? Are they trying to be, use different like ways to kind of bring me down? And that was something that was kind of always in my head, but I didn't recognize that as being like an actual mental illness. It's not necessarily one, but it is a very common symptom. I think it's very common for most people to think that, because we all have these experiences where, we're either like, I think it's called misattunement, where you're not understood for who you are, or, you have been hurt before, like someone's, like been verbally or physically abusive. So, and then we all have different responses. I know that, I mean, if I'm being completely honest, like my response has been, I lash out every once in a while. If I feel like someone's trying to hurt me, I'll, so I understand those responses in relation to my filter now. So that's just something.
Okay. And so as individuals with diagnoses, I mean, the stigma is so strong in our communities. How were you able to get to that place to openly share? Was there like a moment, or, I mean, for me, that like over time in my life, there were politicians that would now and then hold different Asian American mental health conferences or events, and it was also inspiring to see them happen, because they were very far and few between. And so I went to those, and then I wanted to continue making them happen. I felt that in order to be an advocate, I also have to, like, if I want to, like, I think the suicide rates of Asian Americans were also in motivating me to start speaking out. Christina Wong, she did a show called Wong Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And there was also a teacher, Dr. Eliza No from Cal State Fullerton, who wrote about suicidality among Asian American women. And so it, with all these other people, you know, a part of my life before I started advocating, I thought, you know, like Emma Watson said something like, if not who, and if not now, like, or maybe I'm saying it wrong, but you know, it's like, who's going to do it if we don't start talking? And if we don't start talking, it might as well start with me. I can't wait for someone else to do it. We just start with ourselves. And I think that's how I started to overcome the stigma, share my story. And I think the more that I started sharing my story, the more it helped me to heal. And yeah, so how about you guys? Pooja.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Emily. I can really relate to that, especially when you said you were going to events and things. One of the things that NAMI has is something called the Ending the Silence program, with the specific goal of reducing stigma amongst teenagers. And these presentations are part PowerPoint, and then they have a speaker. Sometimes I would do one part, sometimes I would do the other. But when I was just a participant watching the presentation, I noticed that they kept identifying mental illness as a biological brain disorder with a genetic component and an environmental component. And I kept seeing this again and again. And I felt it was really validating because it made me feel like this is not my fault. This is not Pooja's fault. This is a medical condition. And that kind of, for me, reduced the stigma around this. And then as I started sharing this professionally, and noticed how other people felt relieved, I was like, oh, there's something to this. There's a real benefit in people talking about their illness, but also talking about it in a very in a more so matter-of-factly way, as you might talk about cancer or diabetes or a heart attack. Like, the chemicals in my brain are not as balanced always, and that leads to certain moods, and those certain moods causes certain behaviors. And so by balancing those chemicals, by learning all these tools that all of us have learned, I can change the way I feel, I can change the way I act. So that really helped, I think, eradicate for me some of the stigma in just like getting educated, and then seeing how that education was so powerful for teenagers. I wish I could have attended that when I was, you know, like 14 years old, not when I was 25. You know, that would have been so powerful to know this resource existed out there. So that's how I kind of overcame over it. Yeah.
That's awesome. Chloe?
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that, Pooja, because my brother, actually, he's a recovering alcoholic and addict, and the medical part is such a helpful component for him. Just being like, it's just your brain sometimes, you know, and it's really important to have that like factual, you know, hard evidence to go back to. For me, actually, though, it was more of an identity thing. And you know, America loves its labels and loves putting you in one thing or the other. And growing up, you know, half Asian, half white, it was like, oh, you're not Asian enough, or you're not white enough. And it's like, I'm both. And it kind of is the same as far as when dealing with my mental health issues of like, for the longest time, I thought I had to kind of separate the two. Like, okay, here's my like, you know, damaged, sad, anxious part of me because of my, you know, home life. But then, okay, I'm also gonna just try really hard at school and pretend like nothing is wrong and be a really social, active person. And there was such a disconnect. And it wasn't really until in my professional working life after college where obviously that's not a sustainable way to live. And it just became so conflicting and so hard for me to feel like I could mesh the two. And yeah, just hearing other people talk about it and realizing and seeing like big figures talk about it too, and realizing, oh, wow, you can be a successful, functional human being in the world, but also have issues and, you know, be damaged or be sad or have bad days or have anxiety or, you know, just struggle, you know, like talking with all of you, like I'd say we're all like doing pretty well for ourselves and are successful, and yet we all have such pain and struggles that we have dealt with and that we're still dealing with, and being okay with just being both, you know. You don't have to be one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't have to be perfect because we are humans. And humans, it's okay to make mistakes, and we're not robots. So Darren, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick thing, because it's so current. When I was posting about this event, I found myself not even posting on Facebook because my profile is more public. I mean, this is really the first time I've ever gone this publicly and being so direct about OCD, anxiety, and depression. So to be quite honest, I think I'm still working through that stigma. You know, I think I had mentioned to you guys earlier, you know, in the conversation, like even in a relationship, I put a disclaimer on it, you know, to her. I was like, hey, you know, but I do have X, Y, and Z, right? And so I think I don't know when I'm ever going to get over that stigma. It's easier given the conversation, but I'm still working through it.
I agree.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Emily. I was just agreeing.
It's okay. I mean, it is a sensitive topic, so it's like you're not. It's kind of scary to know or like to share about your mental illness to other people while you're dating, or if you have a new job, or but I think that I think there's this one quote I like to quote from John Lennon. He said something like, if you may not get many friends from being honest, something about honesty, and if but if you're honest, you know, you'll get the right friends. And sorry, I didn't have the right quote, but I think that it's just when you're very honest with other people, then the right people come to you, because then it's like your values will be aligned with each other. And if they have similar interests, and you know, they care about this topic, then I think then, you know, they might become a very good friend, and you know, and a good support. So yeah, Chloe, you want to say something? Oh, and then Jude.
No, go for it, dude. I was just agreeing with Darren and saying that, like, yeah, I'm not at all like, oh yes, my life is perfectly meshed and I'm really successful. Like, no, it's an ongoing battle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, Emily, I really like what you said, because that kind of sense of authenticity and owning who you are, including your problems, including your damage, including your struggles, it's really the only way to draw other authentic connections towards you. Like, I think that we could all, if we chose to, kind of follow in the footsteps of our predecessors and just shove it all down inside, never say anything, never admit that you have a problem, just save face, live your whole life. We could succeed that way, but ultimately, it wouldn't be authentic. I think that we would not be doing the kind of work that we can do now that really reaches people and that can really change something, because we're not being authentic. And when we choose to open up, as we are doing to any extent, Darren, even if you don't feel like you're owning it fully, but you're here, and that's huge, you're talking about it, and that's huge. The more that we do that, the more of these opportunities come to us, which is something that I found in pretty much any endeavor in life. If you're authentic to what's actually unique about you, instead of playing a role, instead of trying to hide who you are, the more real chances you have to keep growing and to keep doing something special. But it's hard and it's really scary to admit these things.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it was such a freeing experience when I first started sharing my story. And even though my you know, part of my community and my family were not so supportive, like at least I did was validated by other people, even politicians who were like, wow, you're doing a great job alleviating the stigma and sharing your story, and so it's like, hey, Molly, look, like I'm being asked to speak at these different colleges. So, me going through these experiences of depression and anxiety were worth it, like it had a purpose. So yeah. Joan and
really helps.
Mm-hmm.
You know what else really helps to get over the stigma?
Absolutely.
Is age. So just kind of like at a certain point, I sort of went, I'm 35. I have a kid. No one pays for me. I can be whatever I want. And if they're upset about it, in terms of elders, it's like, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
What, ground me?
Yeah. Joan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. I was just gonna say, there's a lot of joy that goes into being able to express yourself authentically, kind of like everyone was saying, and like share, hey, this is, an illness and it comes with me. But I do recognize that, like, according to, the other, plane of thought, it would be more like, okay, there is a risk to, actually divulging at work. For example, I've only divulged the serious condition, the schizophrenia, to one person at work. I don't know if any of them have signed on and watched, but there is a risk. You don't want to, because there could be discriminatory behavior. Sometimes certain industries kind of lag a little bit in terms of being able to accept people who have different disabilities and conditions, especially if they're invisible, I would say. And this is an invisible illness. So yeah, there is a level of risk, and that is something that I have had to navigate in my own life. Like, when do I tell someone? When do I not? Who should I tell? I tell the people that I know personally, but I don't introduce myself with it. So yeah, there's a lot of managing that goes on here. So.
For sure. I kind of think of it this like this coming out process with your diagnoses similar to that of the LGBTQ, like when the coming out process. So there's a lot of similarities there. Let's go to the next set of questions about like seeking help. What was the turning point in your life that made you realize that you needed help? So, and how did you go about finding help? Go ahead, Darren.
Or Pooja, did you want to go? Sorry, I didn't know if you're.
No. I think sometimes when I'm laughing, it might look like I'm talking, but I'm just laughing. So I got a message that maybe there was an issue with my mic, but I'm listening. Go ahead.
Well, I think the first turning point for me was obviously the rage in high school and how that was kind of really just inflicting a lot of pain on my family and in particular my sister. And that sent me down, I think, through traditional therapy, talk therapy, Western therapy. And then I think the second turning point was more recent. And that was, once I had kind of unmasked all this stuff from talk therapy, the anxiety, the OCD, and then more seriously, the clinical depression, just having a hard time getting out of bed, not really being able to find joy, especially for me as a creative. I've been very fortunate to be able to make a living doing it, and I just could not be creative. And so I think that was when I started to pursue these alternative methods to therapy, acupuncture, EMDR. But what really kind of changed my life was acting. Taking 2 years of private acting lessons really, I think, allowed me to excavate from almost like a different perspective, because you're trying to embody a character. So it's not as personal. And you can go to these places that I think I was really much restricting myself as, within a therapy room. So I think those were the turning points, and then the various methods, which eventually also I should mention at the end, a year and a half ago, I am on medication too. But I think it was the culmination of everything that really got me to this point.
Go ahead, Jude.
I think for me, it actually took another person pointing out that I might need help, because in my early 20s, living independently on my own for the first time and kind of forming relationships and figuring out how to be a person, I had some behaviors that were very, very unstable. I wasn't managing my emotions very well at all. And I was trying to navigate sort of being a young adult without any family support nearby, and just like really definitely lashing out, being quite toxic at times, and probably pretty clearly and visibly suffering at times. It took a person that I was dating at the time who told me, like, I think you need to seek help. I think you need to see somebody because your feelings and your reactions are not like, you're overreacting to everything. You are freaking out about things that aren't even close to reality. It's not good. So I had to hear it from someone else before I could say, oh, maybe this is a valid problem. Maybe I should seek help. And it was kind of like talk therapy plus psychiatric medicine, I think, was probably the first time since I'd been a teenager that I sort of felt alive and normal and kind of in control of myself. But I think that if someone had not pointed out that this is something that you can seek help for, I don't think I ever would have done it.
Yeah, it does sometimes help from a friend or someone who is helpful, support in your life to kind of show that light above your head and like, oh, maybe I should. Like, for me, I know that I noticed that I was crying a lot during a period of my life, and then I was just getting sick and tired of being sick and tired, and like noticing patterns, and then I noticed that I rely too heavily on external validation, and uh, like like I know that I just didn't know how to, when I think people are growing, when they're growing up, they're always seeking the validation of many of others, their peers, their friends, adults, and sorry about that. And hold on a second. Does it, pause for a second, but does anyone else want to chime in? Okay, go ahead, Joan. I'll be right back.
Sure. Yeah. You have your duties. So I'll just kind of talk about. So I think Jude covered really well. Like how like it might be if you need to seek therapy, how a way in which you might hear that feedback, or you might see the pattern yourself, like Emily said. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened in the schizophrenia realm. So basically, a little bit more intensive care, and so I'm going to talk about behavioral health hospitals. So sometimes you can be sent there of your own accord, and you have to like sign something and say you're there voluntarily or you're not there voluntarily. What you declare actually impacts, how long you have to stay and what they might monitor you for. So that's something to know. Another thing to know is, besides being there intensively, so people who have suicidal ideation, people who have, kind of what's categorized as a serious type of mental illness like schizophrenia, they might be sent to these locations, so these behavioral health hospitals. There's another level of care, one step kind of down from that, and down from inpatient, and it's called the one level down is called partial hospitalization program. That's the PHP. So that's contrary to what it sounds. It's not inpatient. It's actually an all-day program where you go and you learn these psychotherapy concepts. They talk about the stuff that Pooja was talking about, which was, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, that cognitive triad. And you learn a lot about like cognitive distortion, so your filters, like, hey, I always feel like people hate me, blah, 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 blah. So that was very helpful to me. I attended one of those. And then there's one level down from that called the IOP, the Intensive Outpatient Program, and that's a half day, and it's the same curriculum, but you don't get lunch, and you don't get art therapy, and you don't get physical therapy. You don't get to play volleyball or whatever, yoga or whatever they do. So that's kind of the other lane of treatment.
That's good that you were able to find resources to help you. How about you, Pooja?
You guys hear me okay? Okay. For me, And I can relate to what you said, Joan, about like those more severe, not severe, those more serious but very helpful and healing programs, whether it's inpatient or PHP. For me, like the process of healing and the turning point where I started to get help was when I noticed the physical symptoms were a lot worse. So I started losing a ton of weight, which at the time I didn't need to. You know, that's not a recommended diet plan. So I just dropped lots of weight. My sleep patterns changed. Like I was either sleeping so long, or I remember like not sleeping days at a time. And then like I felt catatonic at times, and like my speech started to slow, and I feel like I just narrowed as a human, you know, and became very closed off. And I think it was that point that my parents were like, okay, this is serious. Like this is far more serious than we expected. And were fortunately able to help me. And I sought a therapist and a doctor and started to get help. I feel that unfortunately for a lot of people, it happens that way, that you have to hit rock bottom before the turning point comes. And I often wish that wasn't the case. And I think part of us talking here is talking about preventative measures. But I think for so many of us, it is a hospitalization. It is not eating. It is like physically being out of the loop, or like Jude said, like certain behaviors that weren't normal, like where you're finally like, okay, this is really disrupting my life. And now I better do something about it because this is life threatening potentially. So yeah, I'm grateful to my family that they were able to help me out. But I had experienced the symptoms decades before. It was just then when it got so severe that fortunately I was able to get help.
Go ahead, Darren.
I have another question because for myself, I think I could hide it really well. It doesn't matter how bad it got, nobody knew. And because whether it's just me or culture, I didn't want to talk about it. Like talking about it made it worse. So I'm curious to you all, like, just, if you were to tell me advice, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, what is that balance? I don't know, maybe that's part of the stigma, but it's really hard to talk about it and to make sure that you have that safety net that for me, my very close friends, my sister, my cousin, very much held up that mirror for me safely and compassionately. But if I didn't have that, I think it'd be really hard for people to know what I was going through, and it might have been too late. I do agree you kind of have to hit rock bottom, but how do you hit that safely, I guess, is my question.
Go ahead, Jude.
And I think that you might want to ask yourself, what exactly are you picturing that would go wrong if you chose to reveal it? Like, you don't have to unburden yourself and spill everything all at once onto anyone, but when you say that it's hard to talk about it, I totally relate to that. And I will say that for me, my fear was always to be seen as weak or lacking or a failure in some way. And the thing that pushed me past that was realizing that someone that would think that of a person who is ill, who's suffering, and who's trying and making an effort to seek help, someone who makes that judgment isn't someone whose judgment should hold any weight for you at all. It's not someone who cares. So I guess my question to you would be, what's the fear that stops you from feeling like you can't open up?
Well, real quick too, like to add on to that, for me, it was the burden. I didn't want to be a burden on other people. I didn't want to take up emotional, psychological, and just energy in general on the people closest to me because I knew they would worry. So it wasn't so much that I was concerned about what they thought about me. I didn't want to be a burden. And I don't know if any of you guys can relate to that.
Chloe?
Yeah, I can relate to that so much because pretty much everyone in my family is dealing with some sort of something. And I have been labeled kind of the golden child in my family. And so, yeah, it was like, well, I'm not going to tell them that I'm struggling because then our whole family will fall apart. But you know, burden wise, it's kind of like, you don't know for a fact that's going to burden anyone else. And like Jude said, if it is going to be a burden for someone else, you probably don't want to have them be a part of your support system. And then, you know, self-reflection wise, how much of that burden are you willing to just hold yourself? And so it's like, you know, it just becomes a burden for you. And that's kind of what brought me to that point, is it just became this obsession almost, and this terrible narrative I kept telling myself, you know, kind of just this like this sob story and this view of myself of, you know, it was just this dark cloud, and, you know, I was damaged and I was dealing with this and whatever. And it just got to a point where it was like, do I want that to be my story? Do I want this to be my narrative? You know, I don't want to be like this. And at any point in time, you can change that narrative. Like, I heard somewhat, I don't know what I was listening to, a podcast, something, and it was like, you know, you're in control of your life. You are the president of your life. No one else is. And you can change how you handle things. And also just like being a grown-up now, it was like, I need to snap out of this. Like, how much longer am I going to keep blaming my problems on things that aren't really factual, you know?
Yeah, because if there's like external things that you can't control, I felt like mental health was about trying to steer my own ship and find the coping skills so that I'm not consistently triggered by all these external factors that made me feel like crap. So yeah, Joan?
I think for me, it was kind of learning that no matter what, like I am my best friend as well, because I adopted like a self-soothing voice for myself. I adopted like kind of like a hyping voice for myself and stuff. So that's one thing that kind of helped me to be able to talk about it a little bit more. And then I don't know, but it is true, Darren, what you said. Some people aren't safe people. A lot of people don't, you know, they perhaps they don't see it in themselves, or maybe they've encountered it with someone else, and you know, it just wasn't clear that, you know, whatever struggle you had and how it was manifesting in different behaviors and stuff could be related to something that is a struggle for you. So I don't know, like I don't have a real answer for you, but I mean, maybe a way to do it would be to test people like, hey, are you a safe person by sharing this little bit of information, That's the only suggestion I could have. Yeah.
And I think we also learn how to set boundaries. You know, you never know when you at least try. And if they react in a negative way, then that's when you know, okay, well, maybe I should, you know, stay a little bit further from them and not open up as much. Jude, you wanted to say one last thing?
Yeah, Darren, I want to say that I think something that was helpful for me to not fear being a burden and not using that as an excuse to keep things for myself is you have to like develop a certain sense of accountability for your own happiness, your own success, and your own future. And part of that involves developing some productive selfishness. So as a creative, as an entertainer, as a director, a storyteller, you know that the stories that you want to tell, you are the only person who can tell them exactly as they are and exactly as you see them. In order to enable yourself to tell them, you may find that you do need to open up, you do need to unburden yourself, and you do need to ask the safe people around you to be a support for you. Because if you don't, if you keep those things to yourself, the only person that you're hurting is yourself. And the only future that you are stopping is your own. I think that seeing yourself as something completely unique and uniquely valuable, and knowing that what you have to say is so important, I hope that that would be kind of a motivation to find some ways to open up as much as you need to in order to move forward.
I agree. I think that if you you feel like you're a burden to some people, and you don't have and you don't have enough people, or it's more reason to even meet more people, to make more friends who have, and find other people who are on the same value system as you, who is willing to take that time to hear you out. Those are very important for your support system. And I think you can also find them in support groups. We do have a few minutes left. There was one question from the Q&A that said, what are some things like coping skills that you like to do to keep yourself feeling happy and safe? Jude.
I think for me, like a lot of depression is you don't want to do anything, right? And you feel guilty because you didn't do anything. And then that makes you feel more depressed. So one of the things that helped me the most was starting to do things, thinking about doing myself, my future self, a favor. And it's just little things like cleaning up at night or keeping on top of tasks, keeping on top of work, not because I want to do it now, but because it will feel good later that it's done and that everything's set up. And it sounds like something small, but it's helped me a lot because it takes that weight of guilt off of me, like feeling guilty because I didn't do something.
I think, oh, go ahead, Joan.
No, if you want to share, please go ahead. Yeah, if you have another coping skill.
Well, one of the support groups I go to is called Recovery International, and one of the best tools they shared with me is endorse yourself for the effort, not just for the performance. Because I think that in this capitalistic world that we live in, that is so like focused so much on productivity and grades and achievements, I think that we underestimate ourselves too much, and we don't give ourselves enough credit for the efforts that we put through. We have to pat ourselves on the back for every effort we make, even if we make mistakes. And so I think that's one of the support groups that have helped me tremendously. And knowing that I don't have to be perfect. So go ahead, Joan.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that makes me think of the fact that like a lot of us are measuring against like trying to hit 100% in everything, you know? But like there's no one on the planet who's like that. So yeah, I think that's really helpful for me to hear. So thank you, Emily. The thing that helps me is, I think I kind of just forgot. Core belief transformation. So that positive self-talk and that hyping that I was doing was transforming my core beliefs about worthiness for myself, about the fact that, you know, people aren't out to get me for the most part. And then also, I still have trust issues, but like also that the world is not, yeah, there's a lot of volatility and it's not always safe, but you know, it's not like always, you're usually fine. You know, like bad things do happen, you know, so kind of transforming those beliefs, that was really critical for me. And then the last thing was that worthiness, that positive self-talk, if it felt fake to me, it was hard to digest. So I had to do a little bit of internal work as well. So I had to kind of figure out, okay, what are my values and can I live consistently with them as much as possible? Again, trying not to be perfect because I do make mistakes. But yeah, so living true to what you value, I think was pretty much the key thing that helped me develop my confidence today and my happiness today.
To throw some out of the box coping mechanisms, I mean, I think this is, you know, really for me where storytelling comes into play, writing, creative writing. A lot of the workshops that I've facilitated is that, you know, if talking about it just is too uncomfortable, there's a lot of creative ways to look at yourself from a different perspective or with some disassociation. So for example, like a lot of my characters, I'll write about, infuse some of my mental health characteristics within those characters. And it's actually really healing to see them play out on their own journey with their own arc. But really that's you, right? And even just stream of consciousness writing, visual storytelling. Like there's a lot of forms of expression other than just talking. And I think those tools have proved invaluable for me. In addition to obviously like meditation, working out, diet and all that.
You're on mute, Emily.
Emily.
Oh, Jude, did you have anything to add? Your coping skills? Oh, wait. Jude, hello? Oh. Did you have any coping skills that you have for your mental health?
I don't have anything more to add. I think that I will say one thing, which is that talking with other people who have the same struggles as you and finding ways to support them is often a good way to support yourself too. Going back to kind of what you were saying before, Darren, about being worried about being a burden for others, I think we often find that when we are supporting people that are close to us that need our help, we don't see them as a burden, right? We see ourselves as lucky to be able to help them. And that can help us teach ourselves that those that care about us would feel the same way if we chose to let them in our struggles.
So so that leaves us with another question. Where are you now on your journey?
Great question.
Uh-huh.
I honestly, that's a really hard one to answer for me because it's so much easier for me when I self-reflect to understand where I've been versus where I am, if that makes any sense. Like I can look back on my life and see very clear transition, like transformational moments. As for where I am right now in my journey, like it's just kind of, I don't know. I don't know how to label it. Like it's better than I was, but I'm not at all going to say like I'm healed and, enlightened. But I think we could all agree that we're stronger than we were a year ago.
Chloe, if you were to look back, since you say in hindsight it's easier to look back, in the past, if you were to look back and compare it to now, what do you think you've learned about your mental health journey or yourself?
That it's a much bigger monster in your head. And once you kind of confront it or confront whatever, and that goes for anything really, it's usually a bigger monster in your head. And sometimes I would build it up so much. And then it's like when I finally do tell someone or talk about it or do something about it, I think it's going to be this big moment and it's going to be like, and it's not. And it's like, oh, well, that was anticlimactic. And that, it's just another step. But yeah, it's a bigger monster in my head. It's tough. I feel proud of myself for sure. And I think dealing with mental health issues it's just so up and down, but you just got to keep moving through it. And that's really kind of the biggest thing I think I've learned is like that bicycle quote, you got to keep moving in order to stay up.
In Recovery International, they say something about that, like bear the discomfort in order to gain comfort. So it's like, it may not feel good, but it's like you're trudging through those feelings of emotional vulnerability towards healing. So, and I think since we only have a few minutes, like 2 minutes left actually, the one thing I do want to share is kind of in relation to what you said, Chloe. You are allowed to be both a masterpiece and a work in progress at the same time. So that's like a affirmation that I like. following regarding mental health. And so I know that we shared a list of resources, and I think that it will be posted on the Asian Mental Health Collective website. And I guess one last very quick question, if you can answer it. What advice would you give to others also struggling? Pooja?
I would say listen more and talk less.
I would say be creative in what you look at in terms of tools of therapy. There's a lot out there that might be right for your personality. And then the other thing I would say is, which is why I started this, I still like to think my mental health, I'll just call them things, are my friends. They've taught me a lot, as even though it's been painful, they've taught me a lot and I've grown a lot from them. And I think they're no longer tormentors. They're my friends that am growing to live with.
One last, yes, Jude?
I would just say never be afraid to ask for help from others, because there's nothing as hard as suffering without ever asking for help.
Mm-hmm. Well, helplessness is definitely not hopelessness. We come to the end of our panel discussion, so thank you everyone for joining us. I'm sorry, every audience members who had questions that we couldn't get to all of them, but you can reach us, email us. We'll have our emails or contact information on the resources list, and stay tuned for AJ Raphael's special performance and the closing for our conference. Thank you so much, everyone.